Okay, so this is part two of topic 5.1. And in this video, and in a couple others, we're going to focus on the new political, economic, and social ideas that affected society. So when we talk about this topic, especially this part, we want to make sure that we're able to answer two questions. One, we want to know how the ideas of the philosophers, how did they affect society after 1750? So when we take notes on this, we need to associate name and the idea that they stood for. When we get done with this video series, we're going to talk about why the Enlightenment is going to lead to the series of revolutions in the Atlantic world from 1750 to 1900. So ultimately, we're going to work with docs. And whenever you work with an Enlightenment doc, you have to identify the claim and the supporting evidence to be able to understand not only what the new idea was, but why it came up. Secondly, we need to specifically say what were the new political and economic and social processes. And finally, we're going to end this with explaining how the Enlightenment provided the context for revolutions. So just to review, the Enlightenment was an 18th century intellectual movement that used empiricism to attack traditional and religious-based political, economic, and social processes. In their place, they promoted new political, economic, and social processes that promoted individualism, meaning respected the individual, gave that individual freedoms, and finally led to the person being able to determine their lives on their own, self-determination. That the Enlightenment specifically attacked the traditional political, economic, and social systems, absolutism, mercantilism, and the old social structure that was based on birth. So when we look at the flow of this, the Enlightenment occurs in stages. And stage one begins long before the 1750 start period. Between the time period of 1650 to 1750, two very important gentlemen came up with what's known as the social contract theory. This specifically discussed how governments were formed and is actually going to lead to two political systems. Starting in 1700 and working until 1750, we have the High Enlightenment, where a group of people who lived in France are going to specifically design a government that's going to respect individualism, self-determination, and give people rights. Now, from about 1750 to 1812, other people are going to use the ideas of empiricism and the Enlightenment to study the economic and the social processes and to come up with new ideas in those two areas. So that takes us to the last stage, 1812, where we have the rise and the use of sets of ideas called isms. This is the flow, and I'm not going to cover all of these in this video, but this is the flow that we're looking at. So we start off with the first stage, the political changes in both stage one and stage two. Now, the first thing between 1650 and 1700, we have the development of what's called the social contract theory. This is a theory that focuses on how governments are created. So I want you to pay attention to the term contract. Social means people. But the idea of a contract is that you give up something with the expectation of something coming back. And as I told you before, this is going to lead to two new systems of government. The gentleman on the left is Thomas Hobbes, and the gentleman on the right is John Locke. Now, this is what Hobbes is going to argue about his social contract. And I want you to pause and I want you to identify two things. I want you to identify the main idea of the passage, and I also want you to identify the evidence. Okay, so when we read this passage, remember what we're doing. This is Thomas Hobbes' social contract. And Hobbes is saying that a government is based on agreement, an agreement between the person ruling and the government and the people being ruled. And essentially, both are giving something up. So to me, the main idea is this central thing. The only way to erect a common power, that's government, as may be able to defend from the invasion of foreigners and injuries of one another, to confer all their power and strength upon one man. So let's decode that. What he's saying is that the only way to make a powerful government, which not only protects the nation but protects individuals, is to give all the power to one man. So when we get to the contract part, Hobbes argues that this requires all, meaning the people, to submit their will to everyone, submit their will to the leader in return for protection. Okay, so when we talk about the evidence, why does Hobbes say one person should rule and people should just give up everything to be ruled by him? Well, it's right up top here. What he's arguing is that people are not logical, they're not rational. Rather, they're brutish, they're selfish, they're constantly in war. They essentially are always looking out for themselves and doing things to benefit themselves at the expense of others. That they don't have the intellectual abilities to do what's right. So what Hobbes is arguing here in his social contract is this idea that people are bad, people are selfish. So when a government's made, people give up their rights to be ruled by one powerful person to have their other rights protected. So Hobbes, if you haven't figured it out yet, was essentially arguing for absolutism, which already existed, but he's using the ideas of the scientific revolution and empiricism to observe that the natural laws, people are selfish. And so they need to be made to follow the law by a strong absolute leader. Now, Hobbes, he witnessed the English Civil War, in which a powerful king was executed, and he saw the problems, the violence that the people who executed him, the king, essentially did. Now, this is John Locke's view. Remember what we're doing here. This is stage one. We're talking about the social contract theory, how governments are formed. And the idea of a contract is people are giving something up in return for something. So this is what Locke said. Same thing. Please read it, find the main idea, and the supporting evidence. Press pause now. Okay, so when we break this down, this is Hobbes' main idea. What he's saying is that, first of all, a government's job is to protect rights. and that people willingly give the power to rule to a government. But, and here's the big thing, okay, should have a say in how governments are formed. So he says, because no political society can be nor subsist without having in itself the power to preserve the property, meaning that a government and individuals need to preserve their own property and punish those of that society. Essentially, every one of the members hath quitted his natural power, being give the natural rights away to a government to get protection from the law. So when we talk about the supporting evidence, man being born has proven with perfect freedom and uncontrollable rights, and essentially should have a say in the government. Okay, so let me sum up all this confusing stuff. What Locke is saying is this: in a social contract, all men are equal and all men are independent. So, in order to form a government, they have to give up a degree of freedom to live under the protection that a government provides. Now, this government is made up by the people. So, we're giving political power to a group of people. And then also, this is another part of Locke's social contract. Also, that if a government does end up violating people's rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Okay, so to put it another way, when you talk about the social contract, both Hobbes and Locke are essentially saying that governments are formed by agreements, and that agreement is a social contract. That Locke and Hobbes are different because Hobbes says that they don't have the intelligence, they're nasty, they're brutish. And so they give up some of their rights to live in a society ruled by one person. But see, Locke is different. Locke says governments are formed by smart people, intelligent people, and they're created through agreements between the government and the people who willingly enter into this agreement to receive protection of their rights, but also can alter or abolish the government if it doesn't protect rights. So we have two views of how governments are made. So this is the social contract theory. Now, what is it? Let's talk about what all this means. Essentially, the first phase of the Enlightenment focused on the fact that there is a natural law that forms government, and that's a social contract. That people give up rights to receive the protection that a government provides. But this is where they begin to diverge. Hobbes thinks that people are essentially selfish, nasty individuals who need to be forced. And Locke argues that people are smart and should have a say in government and should also have the ability to change the government if it violates their life. So, future philosophers, political philosophers, are essentially going to take these ideas. They're going to lean toward Locke. And they're going to begin to develop specific parts of political institutions to make governments that protect rights, but also give people the say. These people obviously were in France, and they lived under the French absolutism. On the left, you have Baron Montesquieu. In the center, you have Voltaire. And on the right, you have Rousseau. These are the big three who develop specific political ideas. Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he really pointed to Great Britain as the model government. He argued that in order for a government not to violate people's rights, that the power of government, the ability to make, enforce, and judge laws, should be separated into different branches. And each branch has a check or a power over the other two. So, to kind of put this in context, Locke's ideas for the social contract were much more popular. And they were picked up by the French philosophers who began to design specific parts of the government to be able to make sure that the political process promoted individualism, protected people's rights, and led to self determination. So his contribution was division of power and checks and balances. So this is what he's saying. If the king has all the power, he could basically pass any law that he wants and control the judges. And that would end up essentially violating people's rights. But if we create a government that has an executive branch that enforces the law, a legislative branch that makes the laws, and a judicial branch that interprets the laws, people will much more be respected. Voltaire was the second. And Voltaire is a very interesting person. First of all, he is not a lower class person. He's an upper class and he's highly educated. He's also a writer. And he is one of the leading philosophers because he was so intelligent and so influential. Throughout his stories, such as Candide, as you can see by the right, and otherwise, he focused on giving people civil liberties. These are things such as rights. Most importantly, Voltaire focuses on the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. One of his most important quotes was, "I might not agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend your right to say it to the death." So, what he's arguing here is that any government that is going to be designed and created using John Locke's social contract theory has to, above all, protect civil liberties. The last one is Rousseau. And Rousseau, he was much later, well, he's a little bit later than Voltaire. And he's going to argue that human beings are born good, but are corrupted by society. In his writing called The Social Contract, Rousseau looks into Locke's social contract and argues that the legitimate authority of a government doesn't come from God, doesn't come from, the family name, that it comes from the mutual agreement between the people and the government. Governments are required by the social contract to reflect to the will of the people. This is going to lead to voting. So to review all this, we wanted to make sure that we understand how these ideas of the Enlightenment affected political systems. So our goal, as set forth by the Enlightenment, is to create a political system that promotes individualism, rights, and self-determination. So we begin with a written plan of government that focuses on John Locke's social contract. That we make sure that both the government and the people understand that this agreement involves to equal the government and the people, and the job is to protect rights. Now, if the government begins to misuse its power, the people have the right to overthrow it. Montesquieu says this government that's based around Locke's social contract must be divided into three branches, each with a power over the other two, to ensure that one individual does not become all powerful. Voltaire is going to argue for civil liberties, and this is going to lead to a Bill of Rights. Rousseau argues that this government must reflect the will of the people, and so therefore this is where voting comes from. Now, this is very pure, very theoretical. So as we get later into our discussion, we're going to begin to see some people react against this. That's where conservatism comes from. And the people that want the change, they're going to be called classical liberals. And even because governments control the economy, we're going to see new economic isms such as utopian socialism.